Check Podcasts. Hi, I'm Bruce Williams. I'm the CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Chamber Chats, doing our recording, as always, in the podcasting studios of Czech Television, one of our chamber champions. I will begin, as always, by acknowledging that I live and work in the unceded ancestral territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, known to us as the Songhees and the Esquimalt. Chamber Chats is made possible by the support of Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, and by C-SPAN Victoria Shipyards. So, if you weren't aware, we have a brand new cultural enhancement in our region that you can enjoy to find out more about our history. And what I'm talking about is the Victoria Chinatown Museum, which is located in Chinatown in Fantan Alley. Really cool place. You got to go check it out. A couple of people involved with that joining us today to talk about that. Charlayne Thornton-Joe, first of all, is the Visitor Experience and Facility Coordinator for that museum. Charlayne, welcome.
Hello.
And John Adams is a guy you've probably known from his whole legacy of being the ghost tour guy and the historic expert of this region. John Adams is a board member of the Canadian Chinese Museum. John, welcome to you.
Thank you, Bruce. Nice to be here.
I want to talk about the sort of the area in general. We all know Chinatown at its commercial core on Fiskard Street with the Gates of Harmonious Interest and the legacy of all of that. Has it always, all of the Chinese commerce always been focused in that area of town, in Chinatown?
Officially, Chinatown is about 8 city blocks,
okay,
which surprises people because, as you mentioned, most of the restaurants and the shops that people think of as Chinatown are on one block of Fiskard Street. But it really officially extended all the way over to Market Square, facing Pandora Avenue, and all the way over to Chatham Street, and from Store Street through Government Street up to Douglas Street. So that whole area was Chinatown, and many of the old buildings are still there, but most of the businesses are coalesced on that one block of Fiskard Street.
And John would probably, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
Pandora, which used to be called Lower Cormorant Street, was the sort of the original main street of Chinatown at one point.
Oh, okay. See, I didn't know that. We learn something every day in these broadcasts. This is great. So Chinese citizens, we know, have always made very significant contributions to our business community and to commerce and the cultural life that we have here in town. What were the original reasons that Chinese people chose to come and live in Victoria historically? Why did that happen?
Well, the clock can go back to 1858. Fort Victoria, the Songhees village on the other side of the harbor, maybe a few hundred people in total living here until 1858, when a huge gold rush hit the Fraser River, around where Yale and Hope are today. But Victoria was the funnel. And so everybody poured in from San Francisco and eventually other places, buying their supplies in Victoria. And along with everybody else came Chinese, most of them from California, but eventually they came from Hong Kong and China directly as well. So they came for the gold rush, and they were either going to pan for gold or they were going to sell things to the gold miners. Like most of the other people, 30,000 people who flooded into Victoria during the early gold rush years. And then later they came to do other things as well, including building the CPR. But that came 30 years later.
And when we consider my family, my great-grandfather came from China to the Fraser Valley area to pan for gold. He then went back to China at some point. And then when you look at my grandfather on my father's side, he came as a merchant when the population started to grow to be able to open some of the grocery stores, the gambling joints, be involved in some of the restaurants. And so he would have been one of those merchants that started businesses in our Chinatown.
So the stories of your family, Charlayne, and other Chinese families, there are remarkable stories to be heard about how that all grew around here. Tell me about some of the other stuff that you've heard all through your life from other people.
But, you know, a lot of the stories often aren't told because it's filled with hardship and struggles. And I think one of the important things about the Chinese Canadian Museum is giving us the opportunity to tell the story that many don't even know about, that is not taught in the schools. And stories that I heard from my parents, whether it is, even though they were born in Victoria, they weren't allowed to swim in the Crystal Pool. Visible minorities at the time were not able to. And so they never learned to swim. So because of their fear of not being able to save their children if they were to drown, we never learned to swim. With certain jobs that they were allowed to occupy and not occupy. When we look at some of the things in our history, whether it's segregation of schools, some of the hardships that I wasn't even aware of growing up and became aware of more as an adult. And I think it's important that we realize those hardships, but also the opportunities and the successes and the opportunities that were given to me because of the struggles of my grandparents and my parents.
You tell stories like that about the swimming thing, and people are horrified to hear that. And again, these are stories that we weren't necessarily aware of. We've certainly heard much about how Indigenous people and First Nations were treated, but, immigrants like the Chinese were treated very similarly, right?
Absolutely. And often they forge relationships and friendships because the Indigenous population and the Chinese were often discriminated against. Often they forge friendships, they forge business partners, and in the situation of my great grandparents, my great grandfather married an Indigenous woman.
So, John, let's talk now about you're the history guy. You know everything about this whole region and what's happened since colonization and before that as well. So, again, that core of Chinatown that we talk about as the commercial core, but tell me about the evolution of that, how it, speaking to what Charlayne mentioned with families growing and starting businesses, tell me about that evolution.
Well, to begin with, it was mostly young men. They had left their families in China because they were planning to go home. That was the goal for most of them. They would come here for a few years, make money, support their family, and then return home to live in luxury with their family for the rest of their days. And many of them did go back to China. Some of them ended up coming back here, or the next generation came here as well. But it was mostly young men. So very different, perhaps, from life in China, where they were surrounded by their extended families, and family was really, really important. So they worked hard. They were only planning to be here for a short while. Many of them did not speak any English, and they did many different things. So panning for gold, but running stores, working in laundries, working in restaurants, and anything else they could. Agriculture became a major activity. For some of the early Chinese, they could grow things. They knew how to grow things from their farms in the southern part of China. They couldn't grow the same things here, but they ended up growing turnips and cabbages and carrots, and then peddlers sold them door to door. So actually, the Chinese community in Victoria dominated the growing of vegetables for decades and decades, and delivering them as well. So these are just a few of the things. They came here to make money, and Chinatown became their home, but it wasn't the only place where they lived. There were many of these people. They worked in the brickyards near Mayfair Mall. There were hundreds of Chinese living there. The farms that surrounded Victoria up through the Shelburne Valley, out in View Royal, through Oak Bay, Firefighters Park was a huge area of Chinese farms at one time. The Lansdowne Slopes, Fairfield, Fernwood, they were all over the place. And so the core of the Chinese community lived in Chinatown, and that's where they went for their recreation, the gambling dens and the restaurants and their clubs and so on. But many of them did work in places outside of the core area. They didn't have to live in Chinatown if they didn't want to, but I think many of them felt more comfortable living there. And so certainly it became a place where they could speak their own language, eat their own food, go to their own temples, and they weren't going to be hassled by the white people and the other people who lived in Victoria that sometimes didn't quite understand why they were here to begin with, and didn't always appreciate them either.
Yeah, the hassle part of it, that's almost understating it, John. And we're going to touch on that again. There was an incident that happened actually that was horrific, and it's been recognized, and it involved the Chamber of Commerce, unfortunately. We're going to talk about that and the entire experience of the Chinese Canadian Museum next. Our guests on Chamber Chats today are Charlayne Thornton-Joe, who's the Visitor Experience and Facility Coordinator for the Victoria Chinatown Museum, and John Adams is a board member of the Chinatown Museum Board. So, you talked, John, about the food production. That's the kind of food security we don't have now, that sort of farming was happening because we import so much food. But let's talk about how the rise of the Chinese business community is represented in the museum, some of the artifacts and things and where they came from. I'll just open that up to either one of you.
Well, perhaps I can start off, and Charlayne can join in because her family were so intimately involved with some of the commerce in Chinatown. But in a general way, the Chinese merchants provided goods for the gold miners coming and going, and obviously many of the Chinese miners, but lots of non-Chinese miners also frequented the Chinese stores, and they supplied whatever they needed. Restaurants, and we think of going to Chinatown for Chinese food, of course, but many of the early Chinese restaurants that were on places like Johnson Street were not serving Chinese food at all. They were serving the stuff that white miners would want. And that was not necessarily chop suey.
Mhm.
And the laundries that were in every part of Victoria. The laundries weren't for the Chinese people to go and have their shirts laundered. No, it was for the white people that didn't have time to do that. So the life in Chinatown became very commercial, providing services to Chinese and non-Chinese alike. And I think there's an idea that Chinatown was a forbidden city where people could not go in if they weren't Chinese, but lots of non-Chinese people did, because they, in many ways, kept some of those businesses going. If you wanted a suit made, you went to a Chinese tailor for many, many years in Victoria. So the Chinese merchants really provided a lot of services to the whole community.
Yeah. And just to add, we're very fortunate to have John as our curator at the Chinese Canadian Museum. And one of the things that we want to do at the exhibit is to give people the experience of what it was like in our Chinatown through the years. And of course, with all cultures, one of the best way to reach out to people is their memories of food and restaurants. And so we have things like the original sort of gate that was the entryway of Ming's restaurant, which was on Johnson Street. We have exhibits that show certain food items, herbs, restaurant menus. And those are the things I love having people come in, and you can just see their eyes light up and the memories coming back of family dinners or certain dishes that their grandmother made. And so at the exhibit, we try to show some of the businesses that were there that, as I said, triggers memories, which is always wonderful.
It's such an immersive experience. I mean, first of all, you're in Fantan Alley, which is a very genuine experience. But when you go inside and all those, how did you go about gathering those artifacts, Charlayne? Where did they come from?
Well, John's smiling because through the years, this has been a dream of mine for decades. And when people's family would be downsizing, or if unfortunately if grandparents passed away and they didn't know what to do with items, they would phone me. And I didn't know what was going to end up in a possible future museum, but I didn't want anything to be lost. So I just said, yes, I'll come pick it up. And my basement got more and more full of boxes through the years. And so when this opened, I just brought the boxes to John and said, is anything of value? Is there anything we can use? And fortunately for our basement, John said, yes, we'll take this, we'll take that. And even since we've opened, we've had people drop things off, call me, say, come by and pick this up. For example, we have the original safe that was used at Don Me Restaurant for not only the restaurant money, but for the gambling establishment downstairs and the bootlegging that was done through the years. So that's how many of the items came. And of course, John provided many items as well as support from the Royal BC Museum.
Great. So I want to touch on something that we all participated with, along with Alan Lowe, former mayor, and Charlayne, you as a former councillor. On Labor Day, there was a walk from George J. School to the site of what was the Chinese school. So at that event, I felt it was important that the Chamber of Commerce be there because as businesses, John, as you say, Chinese businesses got more and more successful. A number of non-Chinese businesses came to the Chamber of Commerce, along with the city and the school district, and said, what can we do to stop them from being so successful because it's impacting our business? So the Chamber came back with 3 recommendations. One was to segregate the students out of the population, of the general student population. Number 2 was to deny them the right to own property. And number 3 was a recommendation to cease immigration immediately. Those 3 recommendations came from the Chamber of Commerce in 1922. And because of that, when we learned about it, I did a public acknowledgement and an apology for that on behalf of the Chamber. So things like that, that racism is rooted in ignorance and fear and stereotyping and all kinds of things. But was Victoria any more extreme in dealing with Chinese populations than any other place in Canada? You guys know that for sure?
Well, I think it's sad to say, no, Victoria wasn't more extreme because this was fairly prevalent. The racism, anti-Asian racism, and racism of other sorts as well was prevalent in many places. I think Victoria was just part of that. And the people who came here had probably already experienced racism in various ways in other places. The Chinese who came here had experienced racism already in California. The white people who came here had already probably exerted racism. Not all white people were racists, but certainly many were. And so they had learned how to be racist and perhaps how to live with racism in other places. So Victoria wasn't more extreme, and the acts, the city council acts, the provincial legislation, and later the federal legislation aimed specifically at Chinese, the head tax, the Exclusion Act, the banning of Chinese from contracts on city projects and things like that. All of those things had been tried in other places. So they were not inventing that here. They were simply carrying on. And the Chinese had learned to live with that, but also to fight back in many ways. And lots of the legislation didn't work because the Chinese were quietly, or sometimes quite vociferously, like in the Chinese student strike, they were fighting back. And so eventually things did change. And Chinese could continue to run businesses. In Victoria, there was never any official law that denied the Chinese the ability to own land. The chamber might have suggested it. Mm-hmm. And there were some places like Uplands that wouldn't let Chinese buy land. But in the city of Victoria, there was never any law that prevented them from doing so. And when the city tried to stop them from running certain businesses, like pawn shops, or they were trying to discriminate against Chinese laundries, the city tried to do that, but in the end, they weren't allowed to. So it was happening here for sure, but it was happening in many other places too.
But those kinds of things that John talks about, Charlayne, in your family, you have that lived experience, and that stuff is palpable when you go into this museum. You can just sense it by what's in there, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's, as I said, it's important to tell the stories. And many of the volunteers that I have been able to bring in get to tell about their own experiences. We do know that anti-Asian sentiment has risen since COVID, and many people I know have experienced some form of racism because of it. More so in bigger cities such as Vancouver and Toronto, but there definitely is a little bit of it in Victoria. But going back to the walk on Labor Day, at the time I didn't even know about that event. I didn't know the Chamber of Commerce participation or how they were involved with this. And when you spoke, it moved me. I think it was one of the many times during that day that I broke down in tears. And I just want to thank the Chamber and the school board for recognizing a wrong that was, even though it was 100 years ago, but to issue an official apology meant a great deal to myself and many in the Chinese community.
Well, the fact that it was only 100 years ago, it's a time when my parents were alive. So that's what sort of appalled me even more. But anyway, we're talking about the Chinese Canadian Museum in Fantan Alley. That Fantan Alley is a pretty cool street. We're going to talk about that next. Our guests today on Chamber Chats are Charlayne Thornton-Joe, who's the Visitor Experience and Facility Coordinator for the Victoria Chinatown Museum, and John Adams, historian and a board member of the Canadian Chinese Museum. So Fantan Alley gets a lot of attention as, I believe it's the narrowest street in Canada. How did it come to be? Like, how did that come to exist?
I'll let John talk about the history.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, if you go to Hong Kong or China, you'll find lots of narrow spaces like Fantan Alley. But in Victoria, there are lots of those narrow spaces. So Dragon Alley and Theatre Alley, and some of them that don't even have names, and many of them are behind locked doors. But Fantan Alley has always, I think, been rather intriguing for people because it's open. The gates are closed at night, but at one time there weren't even any gates on the alley. You could wander in and, well, gambling. There was lots of gambling throughout Victoria. Poker on Johnson Street in the saloons, but in Chinatown, it was Fantan and other games that Fantan has hardly played these days. But upstairs, along the narrow passageways in Fantan Alley, there were 6 big rooms where Fantan was played almost around the clock. And there were doors that were controlled by lookouts. You couldn't get in unless you knew somebody, and the hatch would open, the bar would lift up, and you could get in. And upstairs, it was a different world. It was a world of gamblers. And of course, the police would sometimes raid the gambling dens because gambling was not legal. Surprisingly, opium was legal, but really? Gambling wasn't. And so they didn't pay any attention to the opium dens and the opium factories. We had 13 of them, but they raided the gambling dens. And so I think it was Charlayne's dad, actually, who told me that one of the reasons why Fantan Alley has such narrow entrances is because when the police raided the places, these big burly guys, they could only go in single file.
Oh,
It's a little bit wider in the middle, but the narrow entrances just made it a bit more difficult for the police to come in force. And of course, when the police were barging in with their axes and sledgehammers to break down the doors, the gamblers were scurrying out the back windows and into the passageways, not underground tunnels, there aren't any of those, but the passageways that lead to the other passageways and eventually an escape from the police. So that's one of the reasons why Fantan Alley became so famous, because of all these police raids, and everybody knew about it. But it thrived. The last gambling den in Fantan Alley didn't close until 1968.
wow. You know, it's funny, the fundraiser in me, my brain is working around here. I'm thinking, gosh, we should have a Fantan tournament to raise money for the museum. So Charlayne, the important thing is, how do you fund the museum, and what do you need to grow it more?
Well, we do fund it. The whole museum came about with the provincial government official apology to Chinese in 2014. And after that time, they interviewed many Chinese communities and said, what do you want? And we said, we need our story to be told. So 2 years ago, the Vancouver opened their museum in Chinatown, and we opened on February 17th. So we are supported through the funding that was provided to the Chinese Museum Society through the provincial government, and as well as through donations, not only from people in Vancouver, but people in Victoria. There is no charge to come to the museum, but we do have a donation box. And we also have had one fundraising luncheon so far. So right now we're considered a temporary exhibit. And we're doing our best to make it a permanent exhibit, whether it's in this location or any other location. But it is reliant on ongoing funding and as well as donations.
So whatever you can do to get yourself there, do so, because it's an amazingly, as I said before, it's an immersive experience. It's so genuine, and it's easy to access because it's right in Fantan Alley in downtown Victoria. Thank you both for being here today. We appreciate it. Charlayne Thornton-Joe is the Visitor Experience and Facility Coordinator, and John Adams is a board member at the Chinatown Museum. Thank you both. I'm Bruce Williams. We'll see you again soon for another Chamber Chat.